Hi, Michael. It's such a pleasure to have you as my podcast guest today.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And what I'm going to show to everyone is a beautiful book that I had a pleasure of reading before it's going to get released in September. Maybe before we dive in into the questions and your life story, maybe share a little bit about why you decided to write this book and who will be interested to read it.
Well, I think it was a response to people much younger than me apparently being curious about what the art world was like when I started off in the art world. And sometimes that's prompted because young people come to me and they say, well, how did you get started? I want to know how I can get started. And I have to explain to them that it was a different universe and that the way I get started just wouldn't work anymore. And that leads to a conversation about the difference between now and then, the question of, oh, did you actually meet Andy Warhol? And so there's a fascination still, and I always wondered whether my fairly distinct and strong memories of those days were based purely on nostalgia. In other words, one always thinks that the moment that you came in was very important.
Mhm.
So I tried to temper that, but I think in this case, nothing to do with me, it had to do with timing, that the time that I arrived in the art world in New York was quite special. And I won't say it was a golden age, but it was a point at which, first of all, there was a change in the temperature that had to do with the kind of art that was being made. And that
Mhm.
was very, very important. What we didn't know, so in that sense, it was the beginning. I think it was the beginning of an era of creativity. What we didn't know, of course, was that it was also the end of an era of, dare I say it, an emphasis on creativity and not on money. So I don't want to be too disparaging about the art world that we're in today, but in those days it was much less about money.
Yes, and I think we'll chat more about that. But I got the same feeling when I was reading the book. And by the way, I'm in the market for 9 years now, and I found so many fascinating things. And I feel like no matter how many years you've been working or learning about the market, you will enjoy reading this book with so personal stories attached to it.
Thank you. There was, of course, no market in those
Mhm.
days, and that word didn't appear in common parlance in the art world, I think, until the 1990s. I haven't investigated the beginning of it, but I think it was in the 1990s. So um, I would have had a job. I did have a job. I'm not sure if you would have had a job. You would have had a different job. You might have been a dealer in those days, or a critic,
Mhm.
or a curator. But there were no people who thought and spoke about the art market. There were no statistics. There was no data. There was
Mhm.
no
Yeah, it
so
was so
that's
different.
very different. It's hard, perhaps, to be able to look back through today's lens and see a time when the forces in the art world were the artist, the dealer, and usually meaning a gallery, not a private dealer, um, the critics who are very, very powerful and important, collectors who didn't need advice, seemingly, and curators or museum directors. So you had those were the five major roles, and there really weren't any others.
Yes, so true. And I remember reading in the book where you were going to a lot of artist studios and sometimes several times to get this response, whether you like something or not. And a lot of artists were coming to the galleries at that time too, showing their works as photographs, right?
There was a, yeah, um, there was a stand. There were two ways in which an artist would try to get their work to the attention of a gallery owner
Hmm.
or a gallery. We didn't even call ourselves directors. I mean, we didn't have a vocabulary now of
Hmm.
labels. You know, you worked in a gallery, or you were an art dealer, or you were a gallery owner. So um, if an artist didn't have a connection with a gallery, and most didn't necessarily, they were able to, if they were able to, they scraped enough money together to get a photographer, usually a friend, to take photographs of their work. And these were in the form of small 35 millimeter slides,
Hmm.
right? And these 35 millimeter slides would come in a small yellow cardboard Kodak box. So artists would simply turn up at the gallery and they would say, can I leave my slides? As simple as that. And I mean, I never said no. So they
Hmm.
would leave their slides for a week. You know, they might come on a Tuesday and come back on a Friday or a Saturday. Or I might call them and say, yeah, I like what I'm seeing. Can I come to the studio? Or I wouldn't say anything, or they come and pick their slides up and they would know, no go. So that was one system. The other system, which on reflection was really a very collegial one, um, artists who were becoming more successful, meaning they could afford to have gallery assistants.
Hmm.
They didn't have managers or financial people or lawyers, but they would have a gallery assistant was inevitably another artist, possibly younger, and they would be stretching canvas, or they would be buying paints, or they would be doing whatever they needed to be doing. Quite often, and I remember this in the case of James Rosenquist, who was by 1966 really quite well known, saying to me, there's a young man who I know has occasionally helped me, called Charles Hinman, and
Hmm.
he's far too shy to approach you, but I think you should look at his work. So I did, and I ended up representing him quite successfully at that time. So artists would promote their colleagues, their friends, other artists, especially ones they felt were not, I don't know, aggressive enough. I mean, most weren't that aggressive, but it was a much smaller world. So that if somebody dropped their slides off with me, I could probably be at their studio, make an appointment, and be down and start. Most of the studios were in SoHo. I either I was already in SoHo, or I'd go down there, and I could see also two or three artists in an afternoon.
Yes, and I think a lot changed because now the way artists approach galleries is so different, or a lot of artists dream of galleries approaching them because it's so hard to get into a gallery these days. How do you see this change?
I don't quite know how it works, frankly,
Hmm.
uh, because I think that uh, uh, I think gallery owners now probably look to MFA programs.
Yeah.
I've heard that. I don't think there's absolutely anything wrong with that. However, I don't think in 60 years of going to see artists, meet artists, visit artists, I ever asked an artist anything about their education. So I wouldn't know whether an artist was basically self-taught or went to this school or that school or Yale or not Yale. It wasn't relevant. But
Mhm.
I think there is more of a system now, and I think this is also true not only in this country but probably in Europe, of an aspiring artist wanting to go to a specific seat of learning where better known artists are teaching, so that not only can they get the benefit of the experience in terms of what they're making, but they can make connections and network.
Mhm.
So I would say almost from infancy, they're programmed into a system that was very different.
Yeah.
I mean, an artist in 1960s, I don't think they had any thought about networking. They wouldn't have known what that was. What they wanted to do was the ambition was to get a cheap studio, maybe keep a job as a waiter or whatever,
Mhm.
or as assistant to another artist, and hang in there and make something and hope that somebody's going to drive up and like it. So it sounds, well, let's put it this way. It wasn't a professional system.
Mhm.
It wasn't a business. And I don't want to criticize artists today for being in business, but I think that even when they go to art school, they're probably taking courses in how to manage your career. So artists who were beginning to emerge in the 60s and 70s, they didn't have any professional advice about how to manage their career.
Mhm.
If they were lucky, they found a gallery who believed in them enough to show their work regardless of what they wanted to do. And I think that's an important difference, which is that a dealer like Leo Castelli, when he took on an artist, he wasn't saying, I'm just going to show the works that I've seen in the studio and hope they sell.
Mhm.
He said, I believe in you as an artist. I will do my best to sell what you're doing now, and I'm going to continue to be interested in what you will do in the future, which may not have been as saleable or as interesting or as commercial. And the dealer felt it was their responsibility to sell the work, not
Mhm.
the artist's responsibility to create some kind of identity or personality or, you know, the artist should be, the artist was left alone, work in the studio, make great stuff, concentrate on that. The dealer's job was to convey their enthusiasm to their
Mhm.
clients.
Yes, and I remember reading when you were going to studios, you were always looking at something exciting and new that you saw artists are creating. So not thinking too much about what collectors will be buying, right?
I never thought about that. I no, I didn't think that far ahead because actually um, in those days collectors, many of them collecting contemporary art had fairly Catholic taste. In other words, they weren't focused on, I can think of collections that you could say were primarily, I can think of one great collector collecting couple in the 60s, John and Kimiko Powers. As yes, they have a great collection of pop art. But hey, they also had Smithson and Andre, and they had Noland. So what was, does that mean they were all over does that mean they didn't know what they wanted? No, it meant that they actually were looking at individual works of art,
Mm-hmm.
not a school or a movement. So I felt if I liked something, I could show it, because the what I hope comes across in the book is that especially in the 60s in Soho, costs were very low. You could do a lot for little. In other words, I could afford to have a show of John Baldessari and not sell anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wasn't happy that I didn't sell anything. But the point was having the exhibition. It wasn't a failure because nothing sold,
Mm-hmm.
because it was seen by certain people.
And also
So,
the difference was because you were paying artists stipends every month, right?
well, some galleries did that. Yeah,
Mhm.
yes. And the first gallery I worked for, Richard Feigen, had, yeah, they would pay the artist. I'm trying to think of amounts, maybe $1,200, $600, $800, $1,200 a month. And at the end of the year, if that amount had been cleared with sales, then obviously they could make more than that, because in those days they got 2/3 of the selling price. Now I think a lot of galleries work on 50%. So in those days they got 2/3 of the selling price. And if at the end of the year they had received a stipend, but the sales hadn't kept up with that, then the gallery owner usually would take in work as purchased for the gallery. They wouldn't, in other words, the artist didn't ever owe money. So then the gallery would take something, and it seemed to work very well. I know a number of dealers work like that. Many dealers work like that.
Yeah, it's definitely less stress for artists, so they can continue producing and developing
They
their.
they can do it. Yes, they can continue to produce. Right. So yeah.
And can you tell us more about how Soho was developed? Because I remember you opened the second location for the gallery. It was like one of the first galleries in Soho.
How that happened?
Yes.
Um, I think the initiative came from the artists,
Mhm.
definitely. The artists looking for cheap studio space. So in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, Soho was a light manufacturing district, and it was beginning actually to lose light manufacturing. So there were empty spaces. These were not legal for living. So at the beginning, landlords were happy to rent them to anybody. And a lot of artists started off living illegally, which meant they would take a space in a loft building, maybe on a fifth or a sixth floor. There'd be a walk up. There would be electricity. There might not even be a functioning plumbing, so it was very, very rudimentary. So that evolved pretty quickly into a system where the city allowed the artists, and they got what's called an AIR, artist in residence. This meant that they could live there legally and they could make improvements. So I think totally separately from that, the dealer I worked for initially, Richard Feigen, had bought 2 buildings on Green Street as an investment. One of them was a 3-story loft building. And I don't think he quite knew what to do with them at the beginning. But by the middle of 1960, I decided we would use them as one of them as a warehouse, as storage. We had 2 or 3 artists by then living in Soho in lofts, and they were doing very, very big works. They were doing large shaped canvases, like Charles Hinman, Richard Smith, a British artist, David Milne, and others. And this sounds really strange, perhaps, but when I took a collector or a collecting couple to an artist's studio, it was always a big deal because they might buy something. On the other hand, for the artist, first of all, it cost them at least a day, if not more. They got nervous, they cleaned the studio. Are they going to get, do they have to have tea? What are they going to do? Bite their nails? Should the spouse be there? What to do with the kids? You know, so I realized that that even though a sale might result, it was not, didn't necessarily benefit the artist for me to bring collectors in and out of the studio. So I would take these big paintings particularly, and I'd whitewash the walls of the loft building at 141 Green Street and kind of hang them on the wall there, not as an exhibition necessarily, but so the collectors, a small number of very adventurous collectors who enjoyed going downtown, and this was a kind of an adventure for them. You know, they went all the way from the Upper East Side, you know, from 79th and Madison, all to the lower depths. So they'd never been there before, right? They'd been to Wall Street, perhaps, but they had never been to Soho. And so they would get the feel of being in that area, and I'd show them paintings, but it didn't disrupt the artist's day. So that evolved, and all of this happened quite quickly between 1966 and 1968. It evolved into actually having exhibitions in that space, which was still pretty rudimentary. We painted the brick walls white, and that was about it, you know. But we had a building, 3 floors, one for storage. I lived on the top floor, which used to be the offices of a warehouse building, which had been converted by an artist before I moved in. So that's how it evolved.
Yes, and I read in the book that a lot of galleries were making most of their money by selling secondary market pieces, right? At that time.
Well, that was the way many galleries worked. They had a front room and a back room. And I mean, the front room would be the gallery space that the public would come and you'd hang with a contemporary artist. And the back room, you would have not what in those days would have been called contemporary art, but the secondary market in those days would have been anything from surrealist works to impressionist works to abstract expressionist works, which had already achieved a level of success. They'd been sold and resold, but there was no resale market in contemporary in younger living artists. There was maybe, okay, so de Kooning was still alive, Rothko was still alive, and Barnett Newman was, and there was a market, in a secondary market in their work. But other than that, there wasn't. And also, very importantly, the auction houses were not involved in this. They were not involved in the market in contemporary art.
Yes, I think it was a bit till later when Christie's moved into New York, right? And opened the location for the auction house. When Christie's opened their first.
Yeah. Sotheby's was, Park Burnett was an American auction house bought by Sotheby's. Sotheby's, I think, had a contemporary sale. They had a contemporary sale in the early 70s. They had one-off contemporary sales. Christie's was late to the game. I worked for Christie's from 1984 to 2000, and Christie's, I think, started sales in 1977, I think. So, but the idea that you would have currently exhibiting younger artists in auction sales was, I mean, it was thought to be totally counterproductive, because if they took in those artists, the idea was, and the idea was correct, they would sell for much less at auction than the dealer was trying to get. I mean, we're not talking about huge sums of money. If a young artist was selling a big painting for $2,000, for instance, and that was the gallery price, because that's kind of the price things were, you know, for an emerging artist, $500, $2,500, maybe $4,500. Those things went up at auction. They would sell for a few $100s.
Wow.
Now, of course, the idea is to get a very high auction price for an artist that then justify the market price that's being, asked for by the dealer. So the auction houses are playing a very vital, the auction houses are playing a vital role now.
Yeah.
The critics don't exist in that sense. And they have no power. They had huge power then. Yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah, and I also remember you describing the dinners that artists usually have after the exhibitions, when they all go mostly to like Chinatown, where
Yeah. Well, we didn't have any money. I mean, no, it wasn't. There may have been people at those dinners now considered to be famous or glamorous, but in those days, everybody paid for themselves. You put cash in the middle of the table. Artists would, you often had, especially where I still am located on the Upper East Side in New York, the galleries would generally have openings on the same Tuesday evening. So you'd have 3 or 4 galleries who would have openings. Often the artists who had those openings knew each other. And the people who went to the openings were mostly artists and artists' friends. They weren't collectors. The collectors, you tried to get a collectors in before the show opened, so they could see things. The show opened on a Tuesday. You try and get them in on the Saturday while you were hanging the show, because they feel they get they get in early. And then Tuesday night, someone would spread the word that we're going to this or that restaurant, Chinese usually or Greek, because that's where you could have a big table or several tables, and it was inexpensive. So, but there was no, how can I put it? As opposed to today, nobody was watching this. I mean, it wasn't, there were no paparazzi. I mean, it would have been ludicrous to even think that anybody else would be interested in this.
Yes. One of the artists that you mentioned several times in the book, who was also part of those dinners, was Andy Warhol. Can you describe to the listeners his personality? And I even remember he filmed something in your apartment, right?
Yeah, well, I met him at one of those dinner parties, and I guess we remained friends, till he died. There've been lots of biographies of Andy Warhol. I don't think any of them really manage to capture. I mean, he had a personality which was kind of a behind-the-scenes personality, which was of someone who was intelligent, engaged, gossipy, quite charming, could be wickedly funny, knew what he was doing, kept up with what was going on. And then there was a public persona where he would be, like like Andy Warhol. but he was also much more than other artists. He was a good business person because he'd been running a business. He'd been a successful fashion illustrator. you know, for quite a long time before he tried to become a fine artist or a, I don't know how you call it. And in fact, he didn't give up his design business until 1964, by which time he was well into his career
Mhm.
as an artist, because he wasn't sure whether it was actually going to stick, which is fascinating about him. Um, he was very entrepreneurial, and he was always looking for opportunities. I don't know what the film was. I had on the third floor of this building at 141 Green Street, I lived in the back half, and I had a big space in the front, which was great for parties or additional exhibitions. And he wanted to use that space. And he said, can I film there on, I don't know, Tuesday or Wednesday? And I mean, I knew his movies. I knew what they were like. I knew the people in his movies. And I mean, if he said he was going to shoot for 4 hours, it would be 4 hours, because there was no script and people just made things up as they went along. So I had hired a young man whose parents were Philadelphia art dealers, and they wanted their young man to have an internship in New York. And the mother was very protective of this young man, who is very polite, very nice. He'd gone to a very good school. And he was sitting at the desk. I mean, we didn't have a big staff. I had like, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a staff. That sounds too professional. Anyway, I wasn't there that day.
Mhm.
I said, look, this guy, I don't even know, I said Andy Warhol. I don't know in those days whether that would have meant anything or not. I said, this artist is going to come in, this friend of mine, he's going to be making a movie, and he's just going to be on the third floor. So it's not going, so just so fun. So I wasn't there. I came back at the end of the day, and my young friend was sitting at the desk, and he had lipstick smeared on his mouth and this kind of eyeshadow, you know. And in those days, I mean, how can I put this politely? That was to me not what I would have expected. And he was quite excited and flushed. And I said, well, what happened? He said, oh, I got to play a dead transvestite in an Andy Warhol movie. So, um, yeah, so I never saw the film, but you know, he made a lot of movies, and a lot of them never got seen, I suppose. But no, he was also a kind person. I mean, he was a nice guy. Uh, it's difficult for me sometimes to put the person I knew together with the legend that the legend that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, seemingly.
Yeah, but I think he was very smart too. Like I like the stories where you offered him to do a portrait commission for collectors, but also then I think one of them, or maybe it's a different story, where someone wanted to put the image onto the label cover.
Well, that was Dennis Hopper. It was a commission. Yes, these clients of mine wanted to. They thought a movie had just come out, Easy Rider, and Dennis Hopper was the king of cool in those days. And these were young Texans, and they were very cool. They were also very rich, and they wanted to commission a portrait, 5 paintings of Dennis Hopper, and Dennis Hopper. I mean, he had nothing to do with it because as a public figure, um, Andy got hold of these studio photographs of Dennis Hopper, and he made me think that I had chosen the one he used. But another aspect of him was he was very, in a sense, passive aggressive, and like a conjurer, he could think you picked the card, but actually he picked the card. He'd always say, well, what do you like? What do you want? But you always ended up with something that was quintessentially Andy Warhol. I don't quite know how he did it. So I thought I'd pick this image. Then, of course, he made me go and negotiate with the photographer to get, because he wasn't going to rip him off. He wanted to pay him for the image, and he ended up swapping a print with him. But then at the same time, Dennis Hopper, who had been very successful with this movie Easy Rider, made a movie in Brazil, which was very much talked about in the press. It was called The Last Movie. And before it came out, Dennis Hopper, there was an album, there was a soundtrack. And in those days, there weren't CDs, there were records. And Dennis Hopper wanted to put Andy Warhol's painting of him on the cover of the album. Fair enough, right? So I don't know why, he knew Andy, I think. He called me, I didn't know him, he called me and he said, I would just tell Andy I want to use that on the cover. I need his permission. So I called Andy and he said, oh, oh, well, Dennis must be very rich now because he's very successful. How much do you think I should charge? Now, this is being naive. He had done a Rolling Stone cover. He'd actually done jazz cover. He knew, what record covers. He said, oh, maybe, I said, I don't know. I had no idea. And I picked a number out of the sky. I said, maybe $10,000. He said, oh, tell Dennis at 15,000, right? Mm-hmm. So I called Dennis back. And I can't repeat for a podcast the language he used, but he said, but it's my face. He wants, anyway, the movie was one of the biggest flops ever. I don't even know if it ever got released because it had been fueled by cocaine, and it was a mess. It was a complete mess, the movie. The album never came out. But the 5 paintings exist. They're great. I think they're great portraits. Early portraits that he did of Dennis Hopper. Yeah.
Yes, I love that story. And in 1970s, you opened your own gallery. So you decided to depart, and then you were looking for the new space, and you had no programming in the gallery. Was it like common to have not specific niche or style per se that you represent?
I was probably unusual in that respect. I mean, Paula Cooper had very much a stable, we call them, unfortunate use of the word now, it seemed ordinary then, stable of artists who had a kind of connection with each other, big abstract sculpture, Marc de Souvero, Robert Grosvenor, people like that. Pace Gallery had definitely a feel and a look. In those days, it was use of glass or chrome, Ernst Trover, Louise Nevelson. I didn't have a belief that there was one movement that was more where I would say, I want to show all of the artists that work in this way. I liked specific artists, and they could be figurative. I liked Ray Johnson very, very much, and he was a quirky, strange artist. You couldn't even categorize him. And then I showed Sean Scully, who was completely abstract, and always has been. So I think that perhaps one of the things that people might get out of this book, and I've written about this in other books, is that you can like a lot of different things, and you're not wrong. Mm-hmm. If I had an exhibition of an artist and it didn't sell anything, that doesn't mean I was wrong. If a collector buys a lot of work by an artist that they really like, and that work doesn't increase in value, it doesn't mean the collector was wrong if they enjoy what they have. So I enjoyed what I was doing. The downside wasn't great. I wanted to sell things for the sake of my artists, and I often did. But I didn't success was not success was a very good review in the New York Times, but perhaps more important than selling everything out. To sell everything out and get a good review in the Times, that was ringing the bell. But getting a good review or a good review from any of the number of intelligent, good writers in those days was very important to the artist as well.
And were you?
I don't know if that. I don't think that's the case today. I don't know.
No, and were you expecting critics to come to every show of yours?
I would say that we were aware that the New York Times and art magazines employed people whose job it was to go to galleries, right? That was their job, not to write feature stories, but to go to galleries, just as they had a movie critic, they had a theater critic. Did they see every movie or every show? I don't think so. But the gallery art reviewers would pretty much see as many exhibitions as they could. Usually, if they didn't like something, they didn't go out of their way to pan it. They might have ignored it. If they did like something, they wrote a positive, energetic review, which brought people in. So, as you might follow a food critic whose restaurants that she or he have recommended, and you've always found that you more or less agreed with them once you went to the restaurant. Well, there are people who followed different critics, and they understood their taste and what they liked, and they would follow them. Yeah. So they had that kind of a power. Yeah, very important.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that the working in the industry was all about partnerships. So you partnered with a lot of other dealers on selling works, right?
Yes, yeah. You would buy things in tandem with another dealer. If there was an opportunity to purchase something, you didn't have enough money, you'd go half shares with somebody. You would consign things to other dealers if you thought they had a client for it. This would be done, interestingly enough, without a lot of paperwork. I mean, nowadays, there are many law firms have art lawyers part of their, as part of the firm. In those days, there were no art lawyers. There were no art lawyers, period, end of story. So you had a receipt, you had a piece of paper, if you borrowed a painting from somebody, you signed a receipt that they typed up. There was no we couldn't afford lawyers anyway. So
were there any pieces that you bought early on that you still admire and have?
Oh, I have lots. Yeah, well, I would say to go back to the kind of the stipend issue, I didn't have enough capital to give my artist stipends, but I would, when I was in my own gallery, I would buy work. Okay. Some of the work in my personal collection that I am the fondest of and would never sell are works that I had to buy. In other words, I purchased them by default, right? I'm very happy I have them today. And some of them are by people nobody has heard of, and they didn't make their way into the history books. They're very good artists, and others are by people who are relatively well known. So, yeah, anything that I bought for myself. There was a gallery called the AIR Gallery, which was a women's co-op gallery, which was quite near me in Soho. And I bought quite a lot of things at AIR, Howardina Pindell and Dottie Atty and others. It was a great gallery, and things were very cheap. They were always a few $100s. So yeah.
Yes. And then when you had to close the gallery because you were not able to pay the increased rent that the new building owner was
They
imposing,
wanted me to buy the space. Yeah. Yeah.
you finished by a couple of solo shows by female artists. What was the representation between male and female artists at that time?
Okay. So this is my belief, all right, and it could be challenged by anybody. I'm not aware of anybody, any dealer at that time who was my generation who would have not gone to a studio because it was a woman artist. I don't remember anybody ever saying, well, that's a woman, so I'm not going to the studio. So the problem is that the pipeline between art school and having a studio in Soho, in those days, cheap studio in Soho, the pipeline was at least, if not more than 50% female artists in art schools. But the number of female artists, young artists in Soho, whose studios I would have visited, was probably 1/5 of the male. So what happened? What happened between the art school and the studio? I think it was cultural. In other words, the male students, the culture encouraged the male student to sleep on the floor of the studio that didn't have any plumbing or electricity. Possibly the parent who had spent money to send their daughter to art school did not want them to sleep on the floor of an illegal studio in Soho. So I went to as many studios as I was invited to go to, regardless of whether they were male or female. Towards the end of the 70s, I think there were more and more women who had studios and were working. So I think it wasn't, I mean, there was the famous essay by Lucy Lippard, I think, where are all the female art, where are all the women artists? I don't remember the substance of that. I remember it was controversial. Women artists who were young at that time might argue with me, and I'm not going to argue with them, but they might say, oh no, I tried to get into a lot of galleries and they wouldn't even see my work. That's possible. But my experience was there were not a lot of women who asked me to see their work. And yeah.
Yeah, because even when reading the book, like you mentioned a lot of male artists and female names were just a few.
Well, this is very interesting because I had published a book a couple of years ago called Seeing Slowly, Looking at Modern Art. And part of that was to a degree historical. And my editor at the time, who was not the editor for this book that we're talking about, my editor said, when she got the manuscript, there are not enough women's names. Can you change that? I said, well, I can't go back into history and change what was. I said that gives a false impression. I said, I don't think that's the way to improve things.
True.
I think we have to start now, or we start where we can,
Yeah.
or we start, I don't know, we started preschool. I don't know where we start, but we start at some point where, but not by going back into a book and putting in more women's names, because that actually gives a false impression for future readers, right?
Hmm. Yes. And I also really like in one of your interviews, I read that you talked about that art world goes into cycles, usually it's 7 to 11 years. Can you talk a little bit more about it? Is it still the
I think,
same?
yeah, I should amend that. I mean, I used to think that I used to think the cycles were circular. Then
Uh-huh.
I thought they were oval. Now, well, we had a very long run. I mean, I think we've had a very long run, maybe since 2008, if we think that there was a, like from 2008 to now. Now, there have been many upsets. China came in, kind of went out. This now we're talking about the market. As a global thing. Um, uh, I think that I caution collectors who come in while things are doing well that this is not forever. It's never forever, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes if you started buying almost anything in the art world post impressionism to contemporary in 1987, you would see it have increased, almost doubled every year till 1990, right? But then 1991, the Japanese, who had been responsible for 1/3 of the art market, they stopped overnight because of their economy, and everything came down. I mean, it really did come down, and that can happen. And some things, when they come down, they don't get back to where they were. It's usually the contemporary works that are inflated, and then they never quite recover. Picasso, Monet, Warhol, Basquiat, whatever. I mean, those artists are pretty much, they have a place. So they may be easier or harder to sell at any particular given time, but they're not going to lose 50% of their value.
Yeah, that leads to the question of like we talk a lot about art for investment these days. Was it the same back in the 60s?
Nobody bought art for investment. Well, look, nobody who bought a painting didn't perhaps hope that it would go up in value. Nobody who bought a painting didn't hope they hoped it wouldn't lose value. But that was not the reason they bought the painting. They bought the painting because they could afford it. They had expendable income. They could go on a holiday, or they could go to a good restaurant, they could buy a painting. In those days, actually, you're talking about the same kinds of money in a way. A few $1,000s, I don't know. You weren't talking about huge sums of money when it came to the art that I was selling in SoHo. So I never had a conversation with anybody then about future value. It was, they could afford it, and they liked it. Now, I've encountered a lot of people now, and they say to me, "Oh boy, Michael, if I'd only been there then, I would have bought those Warhols or those." I don't know whether I have the courage to say to them, "No, you wouldn't have," because the people who were buying those things were generally being laughed at by other people. There was no value in that other than that they liked them. There was no social value. In other words, it was they were outliers. The paint, that it was minimalism, conceptual art, even pop art, hard edge painting, lyrical abstraction. they were all at one time outliers. They were not being bought by core collectors. They were bought by people who had a sense of adventure, who didn't want to spend a lot of money because they didn't cost a lot of money, but who enjoyed looking at it, owning it, and they enjoyed what I'm afraid not enough people do now. They enjoyed going around galleries and chatting about it and finding out about it as a pleasurable experience.
Yeah, I remember reading, and it made me smile, that you differentiated collectors in the States and UK, that collectors in UK were feeling the works and buying what they felt, what they liked. And in the States, it was all about the circumstances when they bought something, right?
Uh, well, yeah. I mean, big game hunters like to boast about the hunt, right? You know, and it's easier to talk about how you beat the price down, or it's easy. Art is not that easy to talk about. I mean, look at the paintings. You've got two wonderful pictures behind you, right? Now, you sell these to a client of yours, and their neighbor comes in and they say, well, I don't know, what's that? What does that look like? Why do you have that? I can do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it takes courage. So if the person can say, oh, I paid $10 million for that, and the one at Sotheby's went for $12 million. So you don't need to talk about the art because you've already justified, right? Then everybody understands why you bought it.
Mm-hmm.
But they still don't know how to look at it, or they're still bewildered when they look at it.
Yeah. And then you now work as the gallery director at Acquavella Gallery, right?
Acquavella, I've been here for 23 years, yes.
Yes, and you specialize in impressionistic and historical art. What do you think about art market today? I know it
Well,
changed a lot.
we show contemporary art. I mean, we show Lucian Freud,
Uh-huh.
James Rosenquist, and we have Miguel Barcelo, who is a Spanish artist, very well known. Um, we still operate in a same. It's 100. The gallery is 100 years old. It's a family-run business, and it's still run in a sense on the same lines as galleries were in the 19th and 20th century. It's a shop. We have merchandise. You can come in and look at it, and if you like it, you can walk out with it. Now, that's not how the art market works nowadays. I mean, yes, of course, we adapt. You know, we're on Instagram. We sell things. You know, we use technology to sell things. But I believe that there will always be a necessity for a meeting between the work of art and the person who's going to buy it. I think that meeting should take place at the beginning of the interest, not at the end. I mean, your job, presumably, is to create that meeting. But people hire you. Why? Because they're intimidated to walk in to a gallery by themselves. Right? So I need you. I need you now. I didn't, there were no advisors when I started in this business. There were no advisors for 30 years, right? Okay, now there are advisors. So why do people need you? Why do you think they need you?
Yeah, I think the main reason is the market is oversaturated. So a lot of people don't know where to go, how to acquire, what to acquire, and whether they can trust the artist process itself or like the work itself. What do you think?
I think there's something in what you say in terms of the size.
Mm-hmm.
I think it seems overwhelming. I don't think the media necessarily helps because they emphasize paintings selling for hundreds of millions of dollars at auction, and there are people who have budgets of 10 or 15 or $20,000 who shouldn't be put off by that because there's lots of things that they can buy for what they want. I just I wonder if there isn't. I think there's been a huge shift in the culture where we equate value, or at least we equate price with quality.
Mm-hmm.
So that if it's expensive, it must be good.
So true.
So if a movie comes out and it makes $100 million the first weekend, I should go and see that movie because it's successful, it makes money. I don't know if that's a very good criteria for judging works of art. I don't know, because you can put a high price on something, it doesn't make it good. And then there may be things that are very good that are actually, not that expensive. And I think the joy and the fun of collecting art is to talk to people like you, talk to people like me, and eventually develop your personal taste. So you're confident that when you go around an art fair and you see something and you really like it, that if the gallery owner says it's $100,000, I may like it, but I really think that's too much, for that. Mm. Or if they say $20,000, you might say, yeah, that sounds about right. I never heard of the artist, right? I don't know the artist. So I like people who buy things where they don't know anything about it except that they like it.
And to finish the conversation today, and by the way, I enjoyed our conversation. For all the artists listening, maybe give them a piece of advice of what to do these days, how to showcase their work or get noticed.
Well, I think that there are a lot of very good artists who are working outside of Los Angeles or New York or Berlin or wherever, okay? So I would say, first of all, don't worry about becoming an international star. Support your local galleries, get shown in your build a local reputation. I mean, it may sound counterproductive, but I think that the dispersal, I know that if you look at the art market globally at $68 billion, a tiny fraction of that are paintings that are sold over even $30,000 or $40,000. So all over the world, every day, there are people going in and out of galleries, spending perhaps we consider modest sums of money buying things they like. So as an artist, get whatever exposure you can. Don't wait until a top gallery finds you, because they might not. Show locally, show in local art fairs, speak at schools. I don't know. Have open studios, have parties, have your friends, invite people to your studio once every 6 months when you have a new body of work. Other artists, friends, family, even. I mean, I think it's also very important that artists have friendships with other artists, and they don't have to be artists who believe in the same direction or who are painting or making sculpture in the same way. It's important to have someone who is also creating come into your studio and give you honest feedback. as a practicing artist. I think that it's a lonely, you're being an artist is essentially lonely. I mean, you're not like a musician playing with an orchestra. You're by yourself all the time. So let other people in that you trust.
So true. And then I'm gonna show one more time for everyone the
Thank you very much.
book. The portrait of the art dealer is a young man
Yeah, I
that's
used
gonna
to have hair.
be released in September, and I highly recommend
Thank
everyone
you.
to pre-order and get the copy of the book. It's a fantastic read. I enjoyed it, read it in two
Thank you,
days.
Lisa.
And Michael, I appreciate this opportunity
Not
to
at
chat
all.
with
It was
you
a
and learn
pleasure
more.
for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, wonderful. So
Okay.
we got the interview. I
Good.
gonna edit and everything. I think I was asked
Okay.
to publish it closer to the release
Of
date.
course. Thank you.
So it's gonna go, I think, end of August, beginning of September.
Yeah. The book, I mean, I don't quite know. I've never quite known what it means. They have a publication date of September the 3rd. I don't know what's when people can buy the book, but that any time around then is great.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
you now can pre-order, right, on Amazon?
Yes, yes, you can. Yeah. People have been pre-ordering on Amazon. Yeah.
Wonderful. And if anyone would love to learn more about you, is there a way for them to like?
I have a website.
Mhm.
It's Michael Findlay, www.michaelfindlay.com. Very
Wonderful.
simple. Yeah. Thank you.